I'm Rochelle Carey. This is the News Hour, live from Doha, coming up in the next 60 minutes. More overnight airstrikes against fighters in Libya. It is believed Egyptian jets targeted an ammunition depot. Humanitarian concerns in Sri Lanka as close to 500,000 people are displaced by flooding. More than 100 people have been killed. After a whirlwind trip abroad, U.S. President Donald Trump is back home facing new and old challenges.
Hello, I'm Rahul Pathak with sport, with the Monaco Grand Prix set to get underway a little later. Plus, Arsenal manager Arsene Wenger fires back at his critics after he wins a record 7th FA Cup final.
There's been another round of airstrikes over Libya. It is believed Egyptian jets hit residential areas and an ammunition depot in Hon. Egypt launched a series of strikes on armed groups in Libya on Friday after an attack on a bus carrying Orthodox Christians in Minya. Forces loyal to renegade Libyan commander Khalifa Haftar have joined Egypt in its air campaign. So let's take a closer look at where these strikes are happening. Hon is in an oasis town deep in the Libyan desert in the district of Jufra. The first strikes launched on Friday were in Derna, that's 300 kilometers from the Egyptian border that is. Derna is where ISIL set up its first Libyan base in 2014, but it was chased out of the city last year. The UN-backed government of National Accord in Tripoli has condemned the strikes, calling them a violation of the country's sovereignty. Meanwhile, the Libyan armed group Ansar al-Sharia has announced it is formally dissolving. It says its leadership has been wiped out in recent fighting. In a statement, it's asked other armed groups to unite and continue the battle. Earlier this month, Haftar launched an offensive to oust the group from its remaining strongholds in Benghazi. The U.S. State Department says members of the group were involved in the attacks on a diplomatic compound in Benghazi in 2012. Mahmoud Abdelwahid is in Tripoli following all this. So, Mahmoud, what's the latest that we know about these airstrikes?
Well, Rachel, sources on the ground in Houn city in the central desert of Libya say that the airstrikes targeted the municipal building and also a compound that includes a couple of governmental buildings and also some residential areas. They said that there is a number of injured from foreign workers. There is no number of a definite number of casualties, but there is only a number of foreign workers that were wounded by these airstrikes. They also said that the airstrikes targeted a depot of weapons that belongs to Al-Bunyan al-Marsus forces. That's the forces that defeated ISIL last year. Also on the eastern city of Derna, as we mentioned earlier, Egyptian warplanes targeted around 6 locations, including residential areas. And there is a contradiction here because the Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi said that the Egyptian warplanes, are going to target ISIL locations in Libya, but that's contradictory because the targeted locations in Derna, they include residential areas, and they include locations belonging to the Derna Shura Mujahideen Council. The Derna Shura Mujahideen Council is the armed group that defeated ISIL in Derna in June in 2016. So that's contradictory. On the other hand, the Egyptian warplanes have been supporting renegade General Khalifa Haftar against his opponents for the 3rd year. They have targeted Derna for the 3rd time in the last 3 years, and they are also now continuing supporting renegade General Khalifa Haftar in central Libya and targeting locations and positions belonging to armed groups that are opponent to renegade General Khalifa Haftar. So the war now is to support the renegade General Khalifa Haftar more than targeting extremist locations in Libya.
Another development that we're following also out of Libya in just the last 24 hours is the group Ansar al-Sharia has dissolved. What else do we know about that?
Well, Ansar Sharia was founded in 2012, and it started as a small group. And it started, and the war against the renegade General Khalifa Haftar in 2014 in the city of Benghazi, and it was not a big group. It was only one of the many armed groups that are fighting against renegade General Khalifa Haftar. So the Ansar Sharia being dissolved now is not going to cause a substantial victory for renegade General Khalifa Haftar, especially with the fighting is still ongoing in Benghazi against him on the last two strongholds for the Benghazi Shura Council revolutionaries on the beach of Benghazi, especially in Suq al-Hud and al-Sabri districts. The fighting is going on against renegade General Khalifa Haftar in the eastern city of Derna. His forces have been besieging the eastern city of Derna for more than a year now. In central Libya, he's still targeting his opponents, and also even here in Tripoli, in the capital Tripoli, and in the west, there is a lot of armed groups who are rejecting Khalifa Haftar being as a chief commander of the Libyan army.
Okay, Mahmoud Abdel Wahid live for us in Tripoli. Mahmoud, thank you.